Hi, guys. Thank you so much. My name is Lisa Mitchell, and this is a free online course on the trauma sensitive yoga teacher. So, I have to admit, I didn't always incorporate some of the things that I'm going to talk to you about now. Just really from the place I was as a yoga teacher for a long time, I felt that I can trust my own vibes around a student or use my intuition to guide me on whether or not a student would like to be touched or wanted some physical assist. Or sometimes I would think that just because a person, came to my class every Wednesday, that it would be okay to touch them, or they're a familiar face, or I know their practice, so I can assist them or I can touch them without asking permission. And for whatever reason, I'm just thinking and seeing things differently now. So I'm excited to share some of these thoughts, some of these ideas, some of these strategies with all of you, so that maybe this can resonate with you if you aren't really necessarily thinking in this trauma-informed lens as a yoga teacher, or maybe if you already are and just like to talk about and just be involved in this discussion. So thank you so much for really joining me and being open and receptive to this understanding. All right, so let's get it going. The statistics. So we don't know the stories of the people that are showing up into our classes. So we need to have this increased level of awareness as well as a sensitivity to any potential emotional triggers that we're providing, or potentially, obviously not on purpose, but that we may be creating certain triggers as we teach. So some of these statistics are just going to blow you away. And it's really these statistics, and this isn't even all of it. There's so much, trauma and rape and abuse that happens that goes unreported. But the statistics are showing that every year, about 8 million people around the world experience PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, in some form or fashion, and at varying degrees. Obviously, it's like a spectrum, but no doubt there's 8 million people, documented in the world that have PTSD. 1 in 5 women and 1 in 71 men have been raped at some point in their lives, which is just horrible and disgusting, and it's baffling, and it makes me truly, truly sad, but also very aware. These numbers, they're blowing me away. 2.9 million cases of child abuse are reported every year. And again, with all of these statistics, these are the only ones that are reported. There's so much that happens to people that literally go unreported. And there's so many people that are just, wearing down on themselves with these experiences that, perhaps they're coming to the yoga space to find some sanctuary. And perhaps without even realizing it, we are being a deterrent in that process of healing for people without even being aware, of course. Also, just think about it. Just personally for me, I've had injuries occur because, of being pushed too far or in a way that just wasn't really accessible for me. I've had injuries that were long-term injuries from even people that were considered master teachers. So just the fact that sometimes we have to be more aware that only the practitioner can really know how far they can go and what is too much and what is enough. We think sometimes we like to pride ourselves as yoga teachers that we can feel the vibe of the person and we know when to stop, or we know when to touch, but we can't assume anything. We just have to let go of those types of assumptions. Okay, so the teacher's role. We are not therapists, unless you are a therapist, but unless you're a therapist, just know that we are not therapists. We are not trained to work specifically with people of trauma, but rather we're there to create this space for them, to just let them be and to let them, find whatever healing they need through the yoga practice. So that's really what we have to understand. And we have to have this responsibility and this awareness of trauma, and it's such, impactful role across so many millions of people. Okay, so I'd just like to reiterate that being impeccable with your words as a yoga teacher, sometimes that is enough. So being impeccable with your word is from the Five Agreements book. I believe it's by Don Ruiz, and it's really spoke to me just in life in general, being impeccable with your word, like saying what you mean what you say. But I think as a yoga teacher, sometimes we neglect that our verbal skills can go very, very far. Verbal cues oftentimes are enough. people learn in different ways. Sometimes people need verbal cues to really process information. Sometimes they need verbal, backed up with, some type of visual as well. Maybe you have to demonstrate to get a person to understand, but just knowing that your verbal skills can be enough, and that we don't always have to validate ourselves as yoga teachers by being so hands-on and being on top of people. I mean, I've seen so many assists. I've had assists done to me where it can just be really intrusive. And even in our teacher training programs, I expose people to some ways that you can assist people that are just like, I'm literally laying my chest all over this person's back, but I let them know that those types of assists are out there. But I know for a fact that very few people are comfortable implementing such personal assist, for a very long time in their teaching career. So just knowing that your words can be enough is very, very powerful. All right, so then we get to this concept of asking permission. My personal opinion on this is that it's something that I've incorporated more recently into my classes. Again, I apologize if I ever touched anyone and made anyone feel any type of discomfort or weirdness or trauma in any way. If I took them to a place that they didn't want to be in that moment because I touched them without permission, I truly, truly am sorry, and I'm apologizing 100% for that. So what I like to do is ask in a confidential way. Confidential meaning that they're in a position, perhaps it's child's pose, or perhaps they're laying down on their backs or something like that, where you can give them, something that they can do to express that they don't want to be touched. Like maybe in child's pose, while everyone's kind of very inward and no one's really looking around the room to see who's saying or doing what, you can say, if you prefer to not have physical touch today, just give me a wave, or, put your hand on your belly if you would, or you're okay with me offering some physical adjustments today, something like that, I think works really well. I've also had the experience in a class that was, perhaps a class that's very busy, where you have more than like 30 people perhaps in a class. And if more than one person expresses, in this anonymity that they would prefer not to be touched. But if there's any moment that I doubt myself, that I'm like, did that person raise their hand, or was it the person next to them? If I have any type of doubt like that, then I will just not touch anyone, because I think that's a smarter decision to make than to touch someone in error that clearly expressed that they didn't want to be touched. So that's just something that I've had, the experience of, if I'm not 100% sure, then just no one's getting touched, but in my experience, most people are okay with physical touch. It's rare, maybe here and there you get one or two people that might wave their hand, but nonetheless, you still have to be respectful of that. There's other strategies that you can use besides just having someone wave or put a thumbs up or whatever. You can do consent cards. I do like consent cards for the simple fact that you can have yes on one side and no on the other. So say perhaps you have a practitioner that wants some assist early on in the class, but then maybe halfway through or whatever, they change their mind and they just want to have a more inward practice, or they just don't want to feel like the teacher has to attend to them for whatever reason. They can switch the card to say no. So that gives the people that choice, that flexibility, that they can actually change their minds. And just being able to change your mind, is a powerful thing. So I like that about consent cards. Other studios implement stones, like consent stones, where you put a stone at the top corner of your mat if you would like assist, or perhaps if you don't like assist, whatever way the studio or the teacher structures it. A stone is there, it's okay to touch. If the stone's not there, I know not to touch. The only thing about the consent cards and the stones is that there's a little less of that anonymity or that confidentiality, because we can clearly look around the room, and see who wants to be touched and who doesn't. And if you're curious, if you're a nosy individual, or you're just distracted by things like that, your mind might be, oh, I wonder why that person doesn't want to be touched, So I think that there's a little bit of that lack of confidentiality with the consent cards or stones. But either way, it is a very common practice. I feel more and more teachers and more studios are implementing that. So that is one strategy you can use. Otherwise, I would just ask in a confidential way. And I've definitely been to studios that do all of these things and some that do none of these things. I've had teachers that stand up when we're all in a standing position before class even starts and says, raise your hand if you don't want to be touched today. And there's no anonymity, there's no confidentiality. That was just the approach that that particular studio or teacher took. I would prefer, my opinion is that it should be a little bit more anonymous. But those are just, just some concepts that I've seen happening in the yoga community. And you just can't assume. You can't assume that because someone was okay with physical touch on Saturday, that maybe by Tuesday, who knows what could have happened from Saturday to Tuesday. Maybe they're just not in the mood. Maybe something horrible happened. Maybe something wonderful happened. Who knows? But you just can't assume that because someone wants touch one day, that they want it all the time, So that is just something to keep in your mind. All right, so there are definitely things that can serve as potential triggers in a yoga class, particularly if you're working with a community that has had some trauma. There are certain poses that are more likely to induce some traumatic feelings or some flashbacks or taking them to a more negative place. And some of these poses are poses that we do all the time in so many yoga classes around the world. For example, downward facing dog, happy baby, cat and cow. I mean, if you can visualize these poses in your mind, you can see how they are a little bit more vulnerable in terms of, your private areas being more, out in the open or more exposed, so some of those poses can be triggering. And I'm not saying that you can't teach those poses, just know that there's a sensitivity around it if someone refrains from doing them, or, even in some populations, like I have a friend that taught yoga in the prison settings, and they just weren't even allowed to do things like down dog just because of the vulnerability of that pose in that context, so just knowing that. All right, straps. When I brought this into my awareness, when I researched a little bit about trauma-informed teaching, straps can be very triggering for people. God forbid, if you've ever been bound or if you've ever been tied up, a strap can be very intrusive for someone that's had that type of experience. Not that we can't have straps in the yoga space anymore. I'm not saying that, but some of the recommendations that I found is that they should be out of plain sight. So maybe not hanging up along the wall where everyone can see the second they walk into the space. Maybe they can be rolled up into a basket or into a corner of the room, so they're only really called attention to when a teacher needs you to use them for some reason. And also, when you are using a strap or you're instructing the strap, the teacher should be very clear about what exactly they're doing with the strap, right? So it's very specific about what body part is engaged with the strap and where your hands are and all of these things. It should be very very descriptive and very clear. Next, we have language, particularly around anatomical terms like anus or genitals or buttocks. And it's true, it's not that common of a knowledge or language rather in yoga classes to say things like anus, but sometimes you have teachers that will be referring to like, mula bandha or the pelvic, the pelvic floor or the whole squeezing of the root or whatever. And they will say those types of terms like anus or buttocks and genitals and, testicles or whatever, perineum, like all of these things, you hear it, you definitely hear it. But some of that anatomical language can feel a little intrusive for someone that experienced some type of sexual trauma. So saying other words like lifting through the pelvic floor or finding your root lock or something like that, where you're not necessarily using the genitalia terminology or the specific anatomical terms of the body part, is just a way to just have a layer of sensitivity around that. And also the room placement. If you have a practitioner that always chooses to be in the very back of the room where there's nothing but a wall behind them, let them be. I've also been in classes and experienced teachers that will make people move their spot. Like, you in the back, come up here, let's all be together. Or, let's not use the whole room. Let's all come together, or whatever the case can be. If someone chooses to be in the back for a variety of reasons, it doesn't even have to necessarily be from trauma. It could be that they just aren't as confident in the yoga postures, or they know for a fact that they're going to need a lot of breaks. So they want to be in the back. So they're not in, the sight of everyone, where they're not just as a spectacle, so to speak. But sometimes you have to understand that sometimes people are in the back because they don't want anyone walking behind them, or they don't want to be seen from that back view. They feel safer when it's just the wall behind them. So you have to let them be. It might not be your preference in the way the room is situated, especially if the space isn't being maximized most efficiently. But if someone is really like, they go to the back of the room, you let them be in the back of the room. We don't have to control every aspect. As yoga teachers, we're really there to provide a service and to offer a safe and nurturing environment for someone to to do whatever it is that they came to do. Like it's not our agenda, it's not about us. So that's definitely important to think about. All right, so what can we do as yoga teachers to be a little bit more sensitive to the people that show up? Offering choices, right? Choices are so important. Choices, when I was a school teacher, choices were important to get the children to do what it was I needed them to do. People are just receptive when they have a choice. It's empowering for them to have choices. So some things that we can provide choice on, as I mentioned before, let them choose whether or not they want to be touched. It is absolutely up to them. You can also make choices as to whether or not they want to keep their eyes open or closed. I find that a lot of yoga teachers will get annoyed by like, oh my God, this person came to my class and they didn't even close their eyes in Shavasana. But we have to have the sensitivity that sometimes if you've been in some trauma of some sort, that closing your eyes can be triggering. Closing your eyes can create a flashback in your mind, so you can't force people to do those types of things. So you give them a choice. Simple choice can be, if it feels comfortable for you, you can close your eyes. If you prefer to keep your eyes open, try to maintain a more inward focus. Maybe you look down the bridge of your nose, something like that. You're giving them the choice that it's not, you're just giving that option as much as you can. You give people choices. People feel comfortable and empowered when they have a choice. This one, cross patterning, also super interesting to me. And I've had this awareness. So cross patterning is really when you take one body part and you cross the midline, so that you're basically, if your right arm crosses over towards your left arm or your left shoulder, that would be crossing the midline. So there's a lot of research that this is very powerful for babies in terms of brain development. If you ever play with a baby, it's really useful to like cross their limbs, cross the midline of their body. So there's significance of this midline, absolutely. And it helps in trauma survivors as well. And it's so interesting. So basically, anytime you cross your limbs, for example, just think of eagle pose. Anytime you're crossing one limb to the opposite side of the body, it's creating a neurological processing response that is actually very, very beneficial to helping the process of trauma, So I hate to break it to you, but if you're coming to my yoga class anytime soon, best believe there's going to be an eagle pose in there. I love eagle pose for so many reasons, but I know that it's a super hard and challenging pose to really stay with and be in, but there's so many benefits. And just the fact that I now understand this process of crossing the midline and poses that present that opportunity, how calming it can be and how it can serve to assist someone through a traumatic event in their lives, why not? Eagle every damn day. All right, so next we have be available. So being available before class starts, if anyone needs to talk to you about something, be available maybe for a few moments after the class starts. And I'm not saying you have to be at the studio an hour early or stay an hour later, but just knowing that your presence is there if someone needs to talk to you, and you don't have to be in everybody's face. You don't have to be intrusive and talk to everyone like in a way that feels like creepy or weird, but just being available is enough. And just knowing that you are available as a yoga teacher, when your students see that and they understand that, they might not, approach you every time, but if they need to approach you and, knowing that you're available, it can be a very powerful thing for them. So just being aware of that. A lot of times we talk in yoga about present awareness, because so much of yoga is really about that being in the moment, that being in control of your mind, like not being, consumed with yesterday or not worrying about tomorrow. It's like we tap into our breath, we tap into our bodies, and we create this present moment awareness. So allowing your students and kind of fostering that present awareness is very powerful if someone has undergone any type of trauma, because they're in this moment right now, they're in this breath right now, and right now everything is okay. Right now everything is safe. So bringing people to that present awareness, also a very nice strategy that we can do very simply as yoga teachers to be supportive for students that have had some type of trauma. And also allowing breaks, right? So I've definitely encountered teachers that get frustrated when a person, takes child's pose a lot or stops and takes breaks or has to leave the room here and there in the class. But we have to be okay with that. We have to know that if a person needs a break, then they need a break. Again, it's not our agenda. It's not what we value is different than what other people value. And if people need a break, then by all means, let them take a break and don't let them feel bad about it. Like, this is their practice. They're showing up for whatever reason it is that they came to the practice for whatever reason they need to be on their mat for. We are not to judge it. We can allow them to personalize this experience. Every experience is unique for every person that shows up, and we have to honor that. Absolutely. Okay, so final thoughts. Be kind, for everyone you meet is fighting a harder battle. So I thought that was so appropriate. That's a quote from Plato. And just know that maybe you're still feeling skeptical. Maybe you know a yoga teacher that is a little bit skeptical, and maybe they think or they say things like, well, not everyone's had trauma, and that is true. Not everyone has had trauma, and we can't assume that either. But the thing is, I read in some research that I was doing in preparation for this, that someone really made an amazing analogy. When you go to a hospital and you're bleeding or someone's bleeding, the whole entire staff takes this universal precaution, and they treat every person as if they have HIV, and they protect themselves and they protect the environment as if everyone had HIV. Everyone has this blood-borne pathogen, and they act as if everybody does, as a safety precaution. So as yoga teachers, I think that makes a lot of sense, because we need to act as if everyone has had some type of trauma in their life, and that we need to be supportive, and we need to be universally protective of that as well. So I think if nothing else, if those statistics aren't enough to make you mindful, then maybe that analogy of the hospital workers and that universal precaution that they take, and in our field as yoga teachers, we need to take the universal precautions as well. And I think it's just so powerful, It's just so powerful. And again, as I mentioned before, for the longest time, for years, I really just trusted my own intuition in terms of who I can touch and who I couldn't, and I realize now that that I just feel differently, and it's the same thing when you read a book. You can read a book one day and you get a message from it, and you can go back to that same book a year later and get a completely different message. And it's not that the book changed, right? The book hasn't changed at all. It's just that we are changing, and we are constantly changing. We're constantly evolving. And without evolution, then we're just stagnant. So this is kind of where I'm at right now. And I'm so happy that you have this curiosity and that you wanted to engage in these thoughts and this conversation as well, because it is so important. All right, so I hope you enjoyed this short little tutorial on the trauma-sensitive teacher and ways that we can be a little bit more trauma-informed as yoga teachers. Let's stay connected. I'm always on Instagram. LisaLise411 is my personal Instagram account. On Facebook, you can find me as Yogini Dana. I also have a business page called Lisa Dana Mitchell. You can find me there as well. You can also shoot me an email if you have any thoughts, any comments, any questions, any feedback on any of these modalities. My email is lisaDanaMitchell@gmail.com. And again, I thank you so much for being here with me, for listening, for being receptive, and I hope you have an amazing day. Namaste.